Evelyn Carter pressed both hands flat against the kitchen door to keep herself from shaking. She had not eaten in 2 days. She had not slept in a real bed in 4. And in 30 seconds, she was about to walk into a room full of men who had already decided she was worth nothing, and cook a meal that would either save her life or end the last hope she had left. If this story moves something inside you, something you thought was buried, please subscribe to this channel. Hit the notification bell and leave a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now stay with me, because what happens next inside that kitchen is something none of those ranch hands ever forgot for the rest of their lives. The leather bag hit the dirt first. Evelyn Carter didn't drop it. She set it down deliberately carefully, the way a woman sets down the last thing she owns when she needs both hands free for a fight she isn't sure she can win. Her knuckles were white. Her dress was the color of old mud. Her boots had a split along the left sole that let cold mountain air bite her heel every time she took a step. And she had taken about 10,000 steps over the past 4 days to reach this gate, this ranch, this moment. Silver Peak Ranch sat against the Montana mountains, like something that had grown there naturally, the way granite grows slow, heavy, and with no particular interest in making anyone feel welcome. The fence posts were rough cut. The main barn door hung slightly off its top hinge. A long bunkhouse ran parallel to the corral, and from somewhere inside came the low sound of men eating a meal that smelled like it had already given up on itself before it hit the pot. Evelyn smelled it from 20 feet away. Overcooked salt pork, watery beans, bread that had gone wrong somewhere around the second rise. She had fed 32 miners 3 meals a day for 6 years on worse ingredients than whatever was burning in that kitchen, and her hands curled instinctively at her sides like she was already reaching for a wooden spoon that wasn't there. "You lost." The voice came from her left, and she turned to find a man leaning against the fence post with his arms crossed and his hat tilted like he'd been watching her for longer than he'd let on. He was broad across the shoulders somewhere past 35, with a jaw that looked like it had taken some hits and a pair of eyes the color of creek water in late October. Cold moving, not entirely unkind, but not particularly interested in being kind either. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't frowning. He was simply watching her the way a man watches something he hasn't quite decided about yet. "Cole Walker," she said. "Depends on what you're here for." "Then yes," she said. "You're Cole Walker." Something shifted in his expression, but it wasn't amusement exactly, more like surprise, like he hadn't expected that answer and wasn't sure what to do with it. He uncrossed his arms slowly. "You got a name. Evelyn Carter. And before you ask, I'm not lost, I'm not looking for charity, and I'm not here to cause trouble." She reached down and picked up the leather bag without looking away from him. "I heard you've been running this ranch without a proper cook for going on 8 months. I heard your men are miserable and your food is worse, and I'm asking for one chance to prove I'm worth hiring." He looked at her for a long moment. His eyes moved once, a quick involuntary assessment of her size, her worn dress, her split boot, and she saw it happen the way she always saw it happen, the way she had trained herself to watch for it over years of walking into rooms where people made up their minds before she opened her mouth. She didn't flinch. She'd learned to stop flinching a long time ago. "One chance," she repeated. "Let me cook dinner tonight. If nobody likes it, I'll be gone before sunrise, and you'll never hear my name again." He was quiet for long enough that she heard the wind move through the pines above the bunkhouse. "Foreman handles the hiring," he said finally, and pushed off the fence post. "Name's Hank Dawson. He's in the barn." He walked away without another word. Evelyn picked up her bag and went to find Hank Dawson. She heard him before she saw him. A loud, rolling voice telling someone they'd ruined a perfectly good saddle leather by leaving it out in the damp. He was a thick man, thick through the neck and chest, with reddish skin and small eyes that moved fast in a broad face. He looked at her the way some men look at a stray animal that has wandered into a space it has no business occupying. "Hired help comes around back," he said, not stopping what he was doing, which was inspecting the damaged saddle with theatrical disappointment. "I'm not hired yet," Evelyn said. "I'm asking for the chance to be." He looked up then. Looked at her fully, and she watched his face go through a very specific sequence that she recognized. First, a flicker of something almost like humor. Then the amusement hardened into condescension, and the condescension settled into certainty. The certainty of a man who has already written someone off before he's heard a single word they've said. "Lady," he said slowly, the word dropping from his mouth like something heavy. "This is a working ranch, not a boarding house for women who need somewhere soft to land." "I know what kind of ranch it is," she said. "I've worked harder than most men you've ever hired, and I cook better than anything that came off your stove tonight. I can smell it from here." She set her bag down again. "Give me the kitchen tonight, one meal. If every man at that table doesn't eat more than he's eaten in months, I'll walk away and never mention your name again." Hank Dawson stared at her. Then he reached to a nail on the nearby post, lifted down a battered wooden cooking spoon that was missing a chunk from its bowl, and threw it into the dirt at her feet. Not offered. Thrown. The sound of it hitting the ground was flat and small, and every man who happened to be within earshot paused and turned to look. "You want to cook," Hank said. "There's your spoon. Kitchen's a wreck. Supplies are half rotten and we're short on everything. If you can make something worth eating out of what's in there, I'll give you a week's trial. But I'm warning you right now, woman, these are rough men. They don't have patience for something pretty, and they sure don't have patience for something that can't keep up." He said it the way men say things when they mean for the words to be a wall, not an offer. Evelyn looked down at the spoon in the dirt. She looked at it for exactly 3 seconds. Then she crouched, picked it up, and cleaned the dirt from it with the hem of her apron. She turned it over in her hands, checked the handle, tested the weight of it against her palm. "I'll need a clean pot," she said. And she walked toward the kitchen. There were 4 ranch hands standing near the bunkhouse steps who watched her go. 2 of them exchanged a look that said they expected her to be gone by morning. One of them laughed quiet and low, more to himself than anyone else. Not one of them expected to remember this moment for the rest of their lives. The kitchen was exactly as bad as it smelled. Evelyn stood in the doorway for a full 10 seconds without moving, cataloging it the way her mother had taught her. Not with despair, not with judgment, but with the particular focused attention of a woman who has learned that problems don't go away when you look away from them. The flour barrel had been left open. She pressed 2 fingers into the top layer and came away with evidence of moisture. The flour was close to turning maybe 2 days from useless if it sat. The salt pork hanging from the beam had been cut from badly uneven thickness, meant it cooked inconsistently, which explained the half-raw, half-charred quality she'd detected from 20 feet outside the door. The dried beans in the burlap sack near the back wall were old but salvageable. There were some overlooked things tucked deep on the shelves, a jar of molasses that still had weight to it, a paper parcel of dried sage, a tin of apple butter that someone had pushed to the back and probably forgotten. She took a breath. She could work with this. She'd worked with worse. She found a large pot under the work table, still grimy from the last use, and she washed it herself and set a fire going. She sorted the flour, discarding the worst of it, preserving what could be salvaged, and started on bread. Not the simple, flat, dense bread that was standard ranch fare. Her mother's bread. The bread that rose twice, that had some warmth in it, some give the kind that made the hands hurt less and the shoulders drop away from the ears. She worked in silence, and she worked fast, and she worked the way she always worked, completely, without half measures, because she had learned from the time she was 9 years old, standing on a step stool beside her mother's stove, that food was not just fuel. Food was the thing that told people whether they mattered. A good meal set in front of a person who was hurting and tired and hollowed out said, "You are here, you are seen, you are worth feeding." She had always believed that. The hard years hadn't taken it from her. A ranch hand appeared in the kitchen doorway about an hour in, looking for coffee. He stopped when he saw her, startled, like he'd forgotten she existed. "You the woman who asked for the kitchen?" "I am," she said, not looking up from the dough she was turning. "Hank says you'll be gone by morning." "Hank may be right," she said. "You want coffee?" He blinked. "Well, yeah, I reckon." "Sit down then. It'll be 5 minutes." He sat mostly, she suspected, because he didn't know what else to do. His name was Billy, and he was younger than she'd initially thought. Maybe 20, with the kind of face that still had some softness in it that the mountains hadn't finished removing yet. He drank his coffee and watched her work and eventually said, "That smells different from what it usually smells like in here." What does it usually smell like? He considered this with the seriousness of someone who has been asked a genuinely difficult question. Like something that gave up, he said finally. Evelyn smiled at the dough she was turning. That's because nobody's been paying it any attention. Billy looked at her sideways. You think attention changes things. I think it's the only thing that does, she said. Every single time. He didn't have anything to say to that, so he drank the rest of his coffee and left. But she noticed that he left slowly, like he wasn't quite ready to go back to wherever he'd come from. By the time the dinner bell rang, she had prepared a pot of beef and root vegetable stew, the beef from the salt pork rendered properly. The broth built from bones she'd found bundled at the back of the cold cellar, that nobody had bothered with the vegetables from the ranch garden that bordered the east side of the barn, which had a surprising amount still growing in it that nobody had thought to harvest. She'd made 2 full loaves of bread. She'd made a simple molasses cake from the overlooked tin and some of the salvaged flour, and she'd cut it into enough pieces for every man twice over. She carried the pot to the dining table herself. The ranch hands came in the way men come in after a long day of hard work, scraping, settling, expecting nothing, because expecting nothing is the only comfortable alternative to being repeatedly disappointed. There were 11 of them. Some glanced at her with curiosity. Most didn't look at her at all. Hank Dawson sat at the far end and watched with his arms crossed. Cole Walker came in last, stood at the head of the room, and looked at the table. The room went quiet. Not because anyone said anything, because the smell hit them. It's a particular thing that moment when food stops being fuel and becomes something that reaches back into a person's memory and grabs them by the chest. And the thing it grabs for is almost never hunger exactly. It's something older. Something that lives in the part of the mind that remembers being a child in a warm room. Being taken care of, being someone that someone else thought was worth feeding properly. Billy, the young hand she'd given coffee to earlier, was the first one to pick up his spoon. He took one mouthful, he set his spoon down. Then he picked it back up immediately and took another mouthful, like his hands had made a decision before his brain caught up. The man next to him was watching him. Then he looked down at his own bowl. Then he tasted it. The quiet that spread across that table was not the quiet of disappointment. It was the quiet of 11 men who had been bracing themselves for something bad, and found instead something that cracked them open a little. Old Russ, the oldest hand on the ranch, had been at Silver Peak for 6 years. He'd outlasted 2 cooks, a drought, and a rock slide that had taken part of the north pasture fencing. He was a man who expressed his opinions in grunts and said nothing he didn't have to say. He tasted the stew. He tore off a piece of bread and pressed it into the broth and tasted that. Then he said quietly, like it was being pulled out of him against his will, "Lord Almighty." That was all. But in a room full of men who had learned to expect very little from the world, those 2 words landed like something enormous. Evelyn stood near the kitchen doorway, with her hands clasped in front of her, watching, and she kept her face still and her breathing even, because she had learned years ago that hope was a thing you had to hold very carefully or it broke you. Cole Walker was looking at his bowl. He hadn't started eating yet. He was just looking at it, and his expression was complicated in a way she couldn't entirely read, something between surprise and a kind of careful, reluctant attention, like a man looking at something he doesn't quite have a category for yet. Then he picked up his spoon and tasted the stew. He didn't say anything. He didn't make a sound. He just looked up and found her eyes across the room. And held them. She couldn't tell you what was in that look. She would try to tell the story later, years later, and she would always get stuck at that part. It wasn't admiration exactly. It wasn't gratitude. It was more like the way a man looks when something he'd stopped believing in turns out to still be true. She looked away first. She wasn't ready for whatever was in that moment, and she had learned a long time ago that some things needed to be approached sideways. Hank Dawson cleared his throat. "It's edible," he said. The man nearest him, whose name was Jerome, and who had 2 missing front teeth and an opinion about everything said without looking up. "Hank, if you say one more word, I am going to throw you out of this dining room myself." Somebody laughed. Then somebody else did. And then the dining room was loud in a different way than it had ever been. Not the dull, grinding noise of men eating because they had to, but something with actual life in it. Evelyn went back into the kitchen and stood at the work table and pressed both palms flat against the wood. Her hands were shaking. She hadn't let them shake while she was cooking. She'd held herself together with everything she had because she'd known. She'd known the way. You know the things that matter most, that this was the hinge moment, the one where everything either opened or closed. And now it was done, and the men were eating, and someone was laughing out there, actually laughing, and her hands were shaking, and she couldn't stop them. She had made it through. But she understood with the particular clarity of a woman who has been disappointed enough times to be careful with her hope that making it through one meal was not the same as belonging somewhere. It was not the same as being seen. It was not the same as being safe. It was just a first step. And she had a great many steps left. She was still standing there when she heard the door open behind her. She turned expecting Billy again, or maybe Jerome coming to say something good-humored that she'd understand was a compliment, even if it wasn't given that way. It was Cole Walker. He stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at her for a moment, his hat in his hands, turning the brim slowly between his fingers, the way men do when they're working up to something. "You did that with what was in there," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, sir." He nodded slowly. "The molasses cake." "Yes, sir. I haven't tasted molasses cake since—" He stopped. Something moved behind his eyes and then was gone. "Since a long time," he finished. She waited. "You said before sunrise," he said. "If nobody liked it." "I did say that. Nobody said they didn't like it." He paused. "In fact, I believe Jerome threatened to commit an act of violence against my foreman to prevent him from saying anything negative about it." Despite everything, despite the shaking hands and the careful hope and the weight of the day. Evelyn laughed. It surprised her. It surprised him too, from the way his expression shifted, the sharp lines of his face softening for just a fraction of a second. "I'd like to offer you a trial," he said. "A week. You'll have proper supplies ordered in, you'll have the kitchen to yourself, and I'll expect 3 meals a day and no complaints from my men." He paused. "I'll pay you fairly." "What does fairly mean?" he told her. It was more than she'd expected, considerably more. She kept her expression still. "I have some conditions," she said. His eyebrows moved up slightly. "I run the kitchen without interference. Whatever I need to do it right, I need the authority to do it, organizing the storage, setting the schedule, ordering what I think we need when supplies come in. I won't be told how to cook by men who have been eating salt pork and sadness for 8 months. He was quiet for a moment. Then something that might have been amusement passed across his face, quick, almost invisible. "Salt pork and sadness," he repeated. "I'm not wrong." "No," he said. "You are not." He put his hat back on. "1 week. Your conditions are accepted." He turned to leave, then stopped. "Miss Carter." "Yes?" "The bread," he said, without turning back. "Don't change the bread." And then he was gone. Evelyn stood alone in the kitchen for a long time after that. Outside, through the walls, she could hear the dining room, the sounds of men who were for the first time in a long time having more than just a meal. She could hear someone telling a story. She could hear laughter. She could hear old Russ saying something in that low grunt voice of his that made 2 other men respond at once. She thought about the boarding house back home that she'd lost when the bank came. She thought about the 3 towns she'd passed through on the way here, where she'd asked about work and been turned away before she'd finished her first sentence. She thought about 100 small moments in her life when someone had looked at her, looked at all of her, her size and her worn clothes and her plain face, and decided before she'd proven anything that she was someone who could be dismissed. And then she picked up the pot from the stove and began cleaning it for tomorrow. Because the thing about being underestimated, the thing that most people who underestimated her never understood, was that it only hurt you if you let it be the last word. Evelyn Carter had never been very good at letting anyone else have the last word. The first morning began before the sun did. She was up at 4 o'clock and in the kitchen by 4:15, working through the inventory she'd done the previous evening, making a mental list, then a written list on the back of a flour sack she found in the corner of everything that needed to be organized, replaced, or thrown away. The storage was a disaster. Not a catastrophic disaster, but the slow grinding kind that happens when nobody is paying attention for 8 months. Things put in the wrong order. Moisture getting to things it shouldn't reach. Meat stored too close to things that shouldn't smell like meat. She worked through it methodically, quietly, in the gray dark before the sun came up, and she had begun on the first breakfast of the week when Billy appeared in the kitchen doorway at 5:30, looking half asleep and carrying 2 empty coffee cups. "I thought I dreamed the food last night," he said. "You didn't," she said. "Set those cups down and get water from the barrel." He did. He was good at doing things when you told him with enough certainty that they needed doing. "How come you're already working?" he asked, watching her move around the kitchen with the kind of efficient speed that took years to build. "Because breakfast doesn't cook itself, Billy. Nobody's even awake yet. Somebody's going to be in half an hour, and when they are, they're going to be hungry. I'd rather be ready before the need arrives than scrambling after it." She set a pan over the heat. "That's something I've noticed people don't understand about cooking, or about much else. The best preparation is invisible. When it works, nobody knows it happened." He thought about that. "Hank's going to come in here today," he said in the tone of someone delivering a warning. "I expect he will. He doesn't like you being here. I know that too. He thinks—" Billy stopped. "Say it," Evelyn said. "He thinks you won't last. That you'll figure out this ain't the life you expected, and you'll be gone inside a week." He paused. "He said it loud enough last night for everybody to hear. Said it was the same as hiring furniture. Said you'd break." Evelyn turned the pan. "What do you think?" she asked. Billy was quiet for a moment. "I think," he said slowly, "that furniture doesn't cook like that." She didn't smile exactly. It was a smaller thing than a smile, more like something settling behind her eyes. "Eat your breakfast when it's ready and get to work," she said. "You've got chores." He grinned and went. Hank Dawson arrived in the kitchen at 7:30 after breakfast had been served, and the dishes were already being washed. He stood in the doorway with his hat on and his arms crossed, watching her work. "You're rearranging things," he said. "I'm organizing them. There's a difference." Things were organized fine. Things were stored in a way that caused the flour to absorb moisture and the salt pork to age unevenly, and the dried goods on the bottom shelf to be unreachable without moving everything on the top shelf first. She didn't stop washing. "That's not organized. That's stored. You trying to tell me you know this ranch's kitchen better than I do?" After one morning, she said, "Yes, I think I do." He walked in. She heard his boots on the floor. He stopped somewhere behind her, and to her left a deliberately uncomfortable position, designed to make her feel watched without being able to see his face. "I want to make something clear," he said. "I expect you do," she said. "What happens in this kitchen stays in the kitchen. You don't go telling Cole Walker how to run his ranch, or where his money should go, or what we need or don't need. You cook. That's all you do here." She set the pot down and turned to face him. "Mr. Dawson," she said, "I appreciate you taking the time to explain the parameters of this job to me. I'd like to offer one thing in return." She kept her voice even, her hands still, her eyes on his face without any heat in them. "I'm a cook. That's what I am. I will cook better than anyone who has stood in this kitchen before me, and I will do it every single day, for as long as Mr. Walker sees fit to employ me. But how I run this kitchen, the organization, the planning, the ordering of supplies, that is cooking. You can't separate the two. A meal begins before the fire does, Mr. Dawson. It begins with how things are stored and prepared and managed." She paused. "I won't tell your men how to shoe a horse. Please don't tell me how to feed them." He stared at her for a long moment. "You got a big opinion of yourself," he said. "I have an accurate opinion of myself," she said. "There's a difference." He left without another word. She turned back to the washing up and finished it at the same steady pace she'd begun it. But her jaw was tight, not because she was afraid of him. She'd met men like Hank Dawson before, men who couldn't stand the particular side of a woman who refused to be apologetic about existing. What made her jaw tight was the familiar weight of it, the knowledge that she would have to prove herself not once, not twice, but every single day against men who had already decided the verdict and were waiting for the evidence to catch up. She had been proving herself her whole life. She was tired of it, but she was also, as she had always been, very good at it. By the end of the first week, the dining room had changed in a way that no one had named yet, but everyone had felt. The men came to meals earlier. They lingered afterward longer. There was conversation at the table that hadn't existed before. Not just grunting and scraping, but actual exchange, the kind that happens when people have stopped bracing themselves and started being present. Old Russ had started sitting next to Billy, which Billy didn't know what to do with at first. Russ had 40 years of working ranches and a memory like a well-organized barn, and over the course of 3 or 4 meals, he had started telling Billy things, small things, the kind of accumulated practical knowledge that gets lost when nobody passes it on. It had happened because one evening, Evelyn had served a dish that Russ recognized from 30 years ago, from a woman in New Mexico who'd cooked for a cattle drive he'd ridden on as a young man. He'd mentioned it. Billy had asked about the cattle drive, and something had opened up between the two of them that nobody had thought to open before. Evelyn had watched it happen from the kitchen doorway and had said nothing about it. She had just quietly made the same dish again the following Tuesday. Cole Walker noticed. He noticed most things she was learning. He was the kind of quiet man who watches more than he speaks, and as a result, sees considerably more than most. He didn't comment on what was happening at his dinner table. He didn't make a point of thanking her. But twice during the first week, he had stopped in the kitchen doorway, not for any particular reason that she could identify, just to stand there for a moment in the way a man stands somewhere that he's trying to figure out if he can trust. On the 6th day of the trial, he said from the doorway, "My foreman says you told him you won't take direction in the kitchen." She was rolling dough. She didn't stop. "I told your foreman," she said, "that cooking is a practice that begins with organization and planning, and that those things are part of the job, not separate from it. I was direct about it. I didn't argue." Hank doesn't see a distinction. I know he doesn't. She pressed her weight into the dough. "Do you?" Howe was quiet. "Yes," he said eventually. "I suppose I do." She looked up then. "How long have you known Hank Dawson?" 12 years. "Is he a good foreman?" "He's a fine foreman." "But," she said. He looked at her steadily. "He struggles," Cole said, "with anything that wasn't already there when he arrived." "I wasn't already there when he arrived." "No," Cole said. "You were not." She turned back to the dough. "Give me another week," she said. "I was going to give you a month," he said, "if you'd have it." She felt something move in her chest, not hope exactly, but something in the same neighborhood. Something tentative and careful. "A month," she said. "A month. And Evelyn." She looked up again at the use of her first name. He hadn't used it before. "The men are different," he said. And it sounded the way he said it, like he meant for her to understand that this was a considerable thing to say. "I can't explain it exactly, but they're different." He tipped his hat, a slight, deliberate tilt that she was beginning to understand was as close as Cole Walker came to saying something openly grateful, and he left. Evelyn set the dough down. She pressed her hands flat against the work table, and she let herself very carefully believe, for the first time in a long time, that she might have found the thing she'd been looking for. Not because a man had said she could stay, but because for 8 months this ranch had been running on survival, on the mechanical motions of men going through the necessary actions of daily life without anything underneath them. And she had walked in with nothing but her hands and her knowledge and her refusal to be defeated. And somewhere in that first week, something underneath had started again. She had felt it the way you feel a fire catch in a cold room. The warmth is small at first, but it's real, and real is everything. The month stretched forward, and Evelyn Carter settled into Silver Peak Ranch, the way roots settle into rocky ground, slowly, stubbornly, deeper than anyone watching from the surface might expect. Part 2. The month. Cole Walker promised her turned into something neither of them had planned for. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a single moment where everything shifted, and the world rearranged itself into something prettier. It was slower than that, and harder, and more real. The kind of change that happens the way a river changes a stone, not by force, but by persistence, by showing up every single day and refusing to stop. Evelyn showed up every single day. She was in the kitchen before the sun, and she was still there after the last dish was cleaned and the fire banked and the prep laid out for the morning. She learned the rhythms of the ranch, the way she'd learned every kitchen she'd ever worked in by paying attention to what people didn't say. The way Billy always came in quieter on Wednesdays, which turned out to be the day letters were sorted, and he hadn't gotten one from his mother in 3 months. The way Jerome ate faster when he was worried about something, and slower when things were going well, and how the pace of his eating was a more reliable weather vane for ranch morale than anything Hank Dawson ever reported to Cole. The way old Russ's hands shook slightly on cold mornings, and how he never mentioned it, and how a warmer mug and a slightly thicker porridge on those days wasn't something he ever thanked her for, but was something he noticed because he started arriving at the kitchen door 11 minutes earlier on cold days, which was its own kind of thank you. She learned Cole Walker in pieces, the way you learn something that doesn't want to be learned all at once. He drank his coffee, black and too hot, the way men drink coffee when they've spent years alone and no longer notice small discomforts. He ate whatever was put in front of him without comment, unless it was genuinely exceptional. And when it was genuinely exceptional, he said nothing, but came back for more, a second helping being. She discovered Cole Walker's highest form of compliment. He worked from before sunup to after sundown, with the focused, almost furious energy of a man who had decided that keeping busy was the same as keeping whole. He checked on the horses last thing every night. He tipped his hat to her every morning when he passed the kitchen door. Every morning. Without fail. Even on the mornings when he was clearly exhausted and the weight of running this ranch showed in every line of him. He still stopped. He still tipped his hat. And he still said, "Morning, Miss Carter," in the same measured voice, like it was a thing that mattered to him to say. She didn't know what to do with that, so she did what she always did with things she didn't know how to handle. She put her head down and worked harder. It was Hank Dawson who made sure the month didn't pass quietly. He had settled into a pattern with her not open conflict, because Cole had made it clear after the 3rd week that Hank's interference in the kitchen was unwelcome, but something subtler and in some ways more exhausting. He would send men to the kitchen for things at inconvenient times. He would tell Cole that supplies were fine when Evelyn had already told him they were running low, which meant she'd have to either let the meals suffer or go directly to Cole herself, which Hank could then characterize as her overstepping. He left the kitchen door unlatched on a cold night that cost her 2 hours of temperature management to protect the rising dough. He told 2 of the younger ranch hands that a woman who looked like Evelyn had no business being the one to decide what a working man ate. Billy told her about that last one. He told her directly sitting at the kitchen table with his hat in his hands and his ears red with something between anger and discomfort. "He said that," Evelyn said. She kept her voice level. She was stitching the split in her boot sole with a needle and heavy thread working steadily. "Word for word," Billy said. "I'm sorry, Miss Evelyn. I thought you should know. I appreciate you telling me. You're not going to do anything about it." She pulled the thread through. "I'm going to make breakfast tomorrow morning the same way I made it this morning and the morning before that. That's what I'm going to do about it." "But, Billy," she looked up. "A man like Hank Dawson wants a reaction. He wants me angry or crying or going to Cole Walker with my feelings hurt so that he can tell everyone that's the problem with having a woman in the kitchen. He wants me to give him something to point at." She looked back down at the stitching. "I'm not going to give him anything to point at." Billy was quiet for a moment. "That seems awful unfair." "Most things are," she said. "Doesn't mean you stop." He watched her work for a moment. "You ever get tired of it?" he asked. "Just tired of having to be tougher than you should have to be?" The question landed somewhere unexpected. She didn't answer immediately. She finished the stitch she was on, tied it off, tested the sole with her thumb. "Every single day," she said quietly. "And then I get up anyway." The next morning she made biscuits with honey butter because Billy looked like he needed something good to start the day. And because sometimes the kindest thing you can do for a person is to put something warm in front of them without making them ask for it. The twist nobody saw coming arrived on an otherwise unremarkable Tuesday 6 weeks into her time at Silver Peak. She had gone to the cold storage cellar at the back of the main barn in the early afternoon to check on the preserved goods she'd been quietly building up a reserve, a habit from the boarding house years, where a hard month could mean the difference between feeding your guests and losing them. She'd been preserving what she could, stretching what was available, setting things aside against future need, the way her mother had taught her, the way women who understood scarcity always did. She found the cellar in disarray. Not disorganized, disarrayed. Deliberately. The jars she'd carefully lined in order along the back shelf had been moved. Several of the smoked meat portions she'd prepared were gone. The careful system she'd built over 6 weeks had been disrupted in a way that no accident could explain. She stood in the cellar for a full minute without moving. Then she went and found Cole Walker. Howe was in the horse paddock working with a young mare that was still half wild and very uncertain about human hands. He moved around the animal slowly, carefully, with the kind of deliberate patience that Evelyn had stopped being surprised by Cole Walker. She had learned was many things that he didn't appear to be from the outside. "Mr. Walker," she said from the fence. He looked up. "I need a minute," she said. "When you have one." He had one. He came to the fence, and she told him what she'd found without heat, without accusation. Just the facts laid flat between them. Here is what was there. Here is what is no longer there. Here is what was moved and how. And here is why I am telling you this. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "You think it was deliberate?" "I know it was deliberate," she said. "Accidents don't rearrange shelves." He looked at the paddock for a moment. The young mare was nosing at the fence post, watching them with her dark eyes. "I'll look into it," he said. "I'm not telling you this to cause trouble," she said. "I'm telling you because if those supplies keep disappearing, I can't feed your men the way they need to be fed. And I thought you should know that before it becomes a problem, I can't manage." He turned to look at her then directly with that steady attentiveness that she still wasn't entirely used to. "Evelyn," he said. He'd been using her first name for 3 weeks now, and she still felt it slightly, each time a small thing, but a warm one. "When have you ever let anything become a problem you couldn't manage?" She didn't have an answer for that. She went back to the kitchen, and she waited. She didn't wait long. Cole Walker had his own particular methods of getting to the truth of things, and they were apparently very effective because by the following morning, Hank Dawson arrived in the kitchen doorway with his hat in his hands and something in his face that she recognized as the specific expression of a man who has been told to do something he deeply doesn't want to do. "I moved some of the supplies," he said without preamble. She turned from the stove. "Why?" "I was rotating them." He said it the way people say things they've decided in advance to believe. Standard practice. "Rotating them to where?" she said. "Because 3 portions of smoked meat don't appear to have been rotated anywhere I can find them." His jaw tightened. "Those were used," he said. "For what meal, on what date? Because I account for everything that leaves this kitchen, Mr. Dawson. Everything." The silence between them stretched. She looked at him steadily. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't move toward him or away from him. She simply stood her ground in her own kitchen with a serving spoon in her hand and waited for him to tell her something that was true. He didn't. He left. And she turned back to the stove and finished what she was doing because breakfast did not wait for anyone's discomfort, including her own. What she didn't know, what she found out later from Billy, who was rapidly becoming the most reliable source of information about what happened outside the kitchen walls, was that Cole Walker had spoken to Hank Dawson the previous evening for a long time in the quiet of the ranch office with the door closed. Billy didn't know what was said, but he knew that when Hank came out, he'd looked like a man who'd been told something clearly and couldn't find a way to argue with it, which was apparently a new experience for him. "Hank's afraid," Billy told her 2 days later. He'd brought her an armful of firewood she hadn't asked for. He did that sometimes now, small practical things quietly done. "He's afraid you're replacing something. His place here or I don't know. Something." "I'm not replacing anything," Evelyn said. "I'm the cook." "You're more than the cook," Billy said. She stopped what she was doing. "Don't say things like that," she said. "It makes everything harder. I'm just saying what's true." What's true and what's useful aren't always the same thing. She went back to work. Hank Dawson has been on this ranch for 12 years. He knows it in ways I don't and never will. I'm not his enemy. Does he know that? He knows I'm still here, she said. That's probably enough for now. What she couldn't say to Billy, or to anyone, was that she lay awake some nights in her narrow bunk in the small room off the kitchen and thought about the boarding house. About the day the bank sent the man with the leather briefcase. About the way she'd stood on the porch and watched him post the notice on the door. This woman who had built that place with her own hands and her own savings, and 6 years of unresting work, and how there had not been a single moment during any of it when anyone had said, "We see how hard you're working. We see what you're building. We think you matter." She had left that town with the leather bag and the worn dress and the split boot, and the knowledge accumulated like sediment over years, that people who looked like her women, who were too large and too plain and too blunt and too much, were never going to be given anything without having to fight for it first. She had stopped expecting anything different, and that was the dangerous thing. That was the thing she didn't say to Billy, because it was too close to the center of something she wasn't ready to examine. She had stopped expecting to be seen, and when you stop expecting something, you stop knowing how to accept it when it arrives. The storm of a different kind arrived at the end of week 7. Her sister's letter found her on a Thursday afternoon, tucked in with the supply delivery, the envelope smudged from traveling through 6 sets of hands before reaching Silver Peak. She recognized the handwriting and felt something cold move through her because the handwriting was shaking. She read it in the kitchen with the door closed. Her sister Margaret had married a man in Billings who had not been what he appeared. The details were few. Margaret was too proud for details, but the shape of what had happened was clear enough. Margaret needed money. Margaret needed help. Margaret had nowhere else to ask. Evelyn sat with the letter for a long time. She had barely anything to send. She'd been paid fairly as Cole had promised, but she'd been putting most of it aside. Old habit, the habit of a woman who had learned that security is a thing you build in advance or not at all. She had enough to help Margaret. She would have to start again from almost nothing. But Margaret was the only family she had left, and starting from nothing was something she already knew how to do. She wrote the return letter that evening. She sealed it. She did not tell anyone about it. But the next morning, she was quieter than usual, moving through the kitchen with the same efficiency, but without the undertow of warmth that had, without her noticing, become part of the atmosphere she carried. Billy noticed immediately and said nothing, which was the smartest thing he did that week. Old Russ noticed and set his mug down more gently than usual when he finished his coffee, which was his way of saying he understood that something had shifted. Cole Walker noticed at breakfast. He said nothing at breakfast. He appeared in the kitchen doorway at mid-morning, and he said, "Something wrong with the stove?" She looked at him. "No." "Something wrong with the supplies?" "No." He looked at her steadily. "Something wrong?" It was not a question. She set down what she was holding. "My sister needs help. I'm sending her most of my savings. It's a personal matter, and it doesn't affect the work." She said it the way she said most true things, directly, without apology, leaving no room for pity. He was quiet for a moment. "I know what it is to have a family member who needs more than you have to give," he said. It came out simply, without performance, like something he'd carried for a long time and had learned to say without it costing him as much as it used to. She looked at him. "I'm sorry," she said. "It was a long time ago." He reached into the front pocket of his vest and put something on the counter between them. Not handed, put. Set down. The way you set down something that you know the other person might not be able to accept from your hand. It was money. More than she'd sent to Margaret. "Mr. Walker, it's not a loan," he said immediately. "And it's not charity. Consider it back pay. I underestimated what a decent kitchen was worth to this ranch for 8 months before you arrived, and this is the cost of that underestimation." He paused. "Don't argue with me about it." She looked at the money. She looked at him. "I don't know how to not argue about it," she said. I know, he said. Try anyway. The moment hung between them. And it was the kind of moment that is simple on the surface, a practical exchange, a transaction, and underneath is anything but. She could feel the weight of it, the specific gravity of being given something freely and without conditions by someone who didn't want anything back, and how disorienting that was for a woman who had spent a lifetime earning every crumb of goodwill she'd ever received. She picked up the money. Thank you, she said, and it came out smaller than she intended, and rougher and more honest than she'd planned to be. He tipped his hat that same slight deliberate tilt, and he left. She stood at the kitchen counter for a long moment with the money in her hands, and something cracked open in her chest that she immediately pressed back down, because the kitchen was warm, and the bread was rising, and there was work to do, and she had never been able to afford the luxury of falling apart in the middle of the day. But later, much later after the dinner dishes were done, and the ranch was quiet, and she was alone in her small room, she allowed herself 5 minutes. Just 5 minutes of sitting on the edge of her bunk, with her hands in her lap, and the knowledge flooding in around the edges of everything that someone had seen her struggling and had responded not with pity, not with judgment, not with the particular cruelty of a well-intentioned person, reminding you of your limitations, but with simple, clean generosity. It was almost too much. She had forgotten what almost too much felt like. She picked herself up after the 5 minutes were done, and she went to check that the fire in the kitchen was properly banked for the night, and she was in the corridor when she nearly walked directly into Cole Walker, who was coming from the direction of the barn with his hat in his hands and a smear of something on his shirt that suggested one of the horses had had a difficult evening. They both stopped. "Mare's settled," he said, as if she'd asked. "Good," she said. They stood in the corridor. It was late, and the ranch was completely quiet, and the small lamp she was carrying threw light that was too warm and too honest for the particular distance she was trying to maintain. "Why did you come here?" he asked. Not like it was an interrogation. Like he'd been wondering for a while and had decided tonight was the time to ask. She thought about what she usually said when people asked that question. The practical answer, the clean answer, the one that kept her from having to hand anyone anything real. "Because I had nowhere else left to go," she said instead. He nodded slowly, like that answer was the one he'd expected, and the one he'd hoped for, the true one, instead of the careful one. "I built this ranch," he said, "because I had nowhere left to go either." He paused. "Turned out the place you build because you've run out of somewhere better is sometimes the place worth building." She looked at him in the lamplight. "That's the most I've ever heard you say at one time," she said. Something shifted in his face, that quick, almost invisible thing that was close enough to a smile that she'd stopped being surprised when she saw it. "Don't get used to it," he said. He walked past her toward the bunkhouse. She stood in the corridor for a moment after he'd gone, the lamp in her hand, thinking about the thing he'd said. The place you build because you've run out of somewhere better, and the particular way he'd said it, like it was a thing he'd turned over 100 times and finally decided was true. Then she banked the kitchen fire and went to bed. The next morning, she made extra biscuits and left a plate of them outside Hank Dawson's office door. She didn't knock. She didn't leave a note. She just left the biscuits and walked away. Because she was tired of waiting for people to decide she was worth treating well before she treated them well. It had never worked that way anyway. The biscuits were gone by mid-morning. Hank didn't say anything about them, but he also didn't interfere in the cold storage again. And on Thursday of that week, when the supply delivery came, and she was going through the list, he appeared beside her and said without preamble, "You'll need another 20 pounds of flour by month end. I checked the usage rate." She looked at him. He wasn't looking at her. "I already ordered it," she said. "Good," he said, and walked away. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't warmth. It wasn't even respect, not exactly. But it was something. And something Evelyn had learned was where everything begins. The 8th week brought the first real crisis. One of the older ranch hands, a man named Garrett, who had been at Silver Peak longer than anyone except old Russ, came down sick. Not the ordinary kind of sick that a day in the bunk and a bowl of broth handled. The kind of sick that arrives fast and hits hard, that turns a capable man into something frightened and diminished in the space of 24 hours. The nearest doctor was 2 days' ride. Cole sent for him immediately, and Evelyn set up a rotation. Nobody asked her to. She simply assessed what was needed and did it broth that she made from scratch and kept hot around the clock, the kind her mother had made with precise quantities of specific things that she'd learned over years had genuinely restorative properties. She coordinated with the men without making it a project, without turning it into a drama, just quietly ensuring that Garrett had what he needed when he needed it, and that the kitchen kept running for the rest of the ranch at the same time. She slept 4 hours a night for 3 days. When the doctor arrived and examined Garrett, he said the man's fever had broken much earlier than he'd expected, given the severity of what he was seeing, and asked what they'd been giving him. "The cook's broth," Billy said from the doorway. The doctor looked at him. "What's in it?" "Don't rightly know," Billy said. "But there ain't a man on this ranch who'd be sick without it." Garrett recovered fully. On the day he got up and walked back to the bunkhouse under his own power, he stopped in the kitchen doorway and stood there for a moment, with his hat off and his hair flattened from the bunk pillow, and his eyes carrying something that sick men sometimes carry when they've been close to a bad thing and come back from it. "Miss Carter," he said. "Garrett," she said. "You should be careful today. Don't push it." "I know," he said. "I just—" He stopped. He was a man of very few words. He turned his hat in his hands. "Thank you," he said finally, like it was a thing that needed to be said properly, not quickly. "You did the hard part," she said. "I just kept you company." He put his hat back on and left. Old Russ, who had been sitting at the kitchen table with his morning coffee and witnessed the exchange, said nothing for a long time after Garrett went. Then he said, without looking up from his mug, "My wife used to say something like that. I just kept you company. Every time she did something that would have wrecked a lesser person, she'd say she just kept them company." Evelyn looked at him. "She sounds like she was remarkable," she said. "She was the best person I ever knew," Russ said. "Simple, flat. The way you say a thing when there's no point in dressing it up because nothing you could say would be adequate anyway." She poured him more coffee. She sat down across from him, something she rarely did, rarely let herself do, because sitting at the table was different from standing behind it, and she'd always been careful about that line. "Tell me about her," she said. He looked up, and then slowly, like a man excavating something from a deep place, he began to talk. She listened. She thought, sitting there in the morning quiet of a Montana ranch kitchen, with an old man and 2 mugs of coffee, that this was the thing people never understood about food, about cooking, about the work she did. It was never really about the food. The food was the door. What was behind the door was everything else. The stories, the grief, the 30-year-old cattle drive, the wife who kept company, the younger hands who hadn't yet learned what they were going to lose. The door was always the food, but she was always more interested in what was behind it. And Silver Peak Ranch, she realized, sitting across from Russ while he talked about a woman she would never meet. Silver Peak Ranch was full of doors she hadn't opened yet. She intended to open every single one. Part 3. Old Russ finished his story about his wife on a Thursday morning, and by Friday the whole kitchen felt different. Not because anything visible had changed, but because something invisible had shifted the way air shifts before weather arrives. Evelyn couldn't name it exactly. She just knew that when she moved through the ranch that day, she moved through it differently. Like she had stopped being a person passing through and started being a person who was part of the place. She wasn't sure when that had happened. She wasn't sure she was ready for it. The 10th week brought something she hadn't prepared for, which was unusual because Evelyn Carter prepared for most things. She had learned over the course of a life that had not been particularly gentle with her, that the only reliable protection against disaster was anticipation, seeing what was coming before it arrived and making arrangements. She was good at it. She was in fact exceptional at it, and it had saved her more times than she could count. But she hadn't anticipated Cole Walker. Not the way he actually was underneath the hat tipping and the 2-word sentences and the careful, measured way he occupied space. She had anticipated a difficult employer. She had anticipated a quiet man. She had anticipated hard work and low warmth, and the particular loneliness of being useful to people who would never see past her usefulness. She had not anticipated someone who remembered things. It started small. A morning when she mentioned offhand that the wild sage growing on the east slope was past its best picking time, and she'd missed it by 2 weeks. The following morning, there was a bundle of dried sage on the kitchen work table, not from the east slope, but from somewhere harvested and dried properly and tied with a strip of leather. No note, no indication of who'd left it. She knew who'd left it. She didn't say anything. She used the sage and made a roast that evening that had the whole dining room quieter than usual, the specific quiet of people who are experiencing something good and don't want to break it with noise. Cole had 2 helpings. He still didn't say anything. But the following week, when she mentioned to Billy that the breadboard was warping and she'd been compensating for it for 3 weeks, she came into the kitchen 2 days later to find a new breadboard, solid, well sanded, the right thickness, sitting in place of the old one. No announcement, no performance of generosity, just the thing done. She stood at the kitchen work table with her hands on the new breadboard and felt something move through her that she didn't know how to name. It felt something like being paid attention to. Real attention. The kind that listens not just to the words but to the spaces between them, to the small complaints that aren't complaints exactly, but are the things a person mentions when they've been struggling quietly for long enough that it slips out. She had paid that kind of attention to other people for her entire life. She knew how rare it was to be on the receiving end of it. She also knew, with the careful, wary instinct of a woman who had been burned by hope before, that she needed to be careful. Because caring about whether Cole Walker noticed her was a significantly more dangerous occupation than cooking for him. She told herself that on a Tuesday. By Thursday, she was losing the argument with herself. The crisis arrived without warning, the way the worst ones always do. It was a Sunday in the early afternoon, when the ranch was quiet, with the particular stillness of a day off. Men mending tack, writing letters, sleeping in the bunkhouse. Evelyn was doing inventory in the cold storage, working through her supply ledger, when she heard voices outside the barn that were wrong. Not in volume, but in quality, tight controlled, the kind of voices people use when they are keeping something contained that very badly wants to not be contained. She came out of the cold storage and found Billy standing at the barn entrance, with his face doing something complicated. "What happened?" she said. "There's a man out front," Billy said. "Says he's got business with Cole." The way he said it told her everything about what kind of business it was. She went out. There were 3 men at the front gate. One of them was doing the talking, a man in a dark coat with clean hands and a way of holding himself that said he'd never done physical work in his life and considered this a point in his favor. The other 2 stood behind him in the particular arrangement of men who are there to make a third man seem more significant. Cole was standing at the gate. She couldn't see his face from where she was standing, but she could see his shoulders, and his shoulders were doing something she'd never seen them do before, which was hold very, very still in the specific way of a man who is managing something enormous. She didn't go closer. She waited. The man in the dark coat was talking about money. She caught enough to understand that debt, some claim on the ranch, some arrangement from years past that had not been resolved in the way the man in the dark coat felt it should have been. She didn't hear the specifics. She wasn't trying to hear the specifics. She was watching Cole, and what she was watching told her more than the words would have. He was afraid. Not the loud, reactive fear of someone surprised. The quiet, deep fear of someone confronting something they've been dreading for a long time, something they knew was coming and hoped wouldn't, and now it has. The 3 men left eventually. Cole stood at the gate for a long time after they went. She went back to the kitchen. She put coffee on. She cut the remaining portion of the apple cake she'd made that morning and set it on the table. She waited. 20 minutes later, he came in. He didn't look at her. He sat down at the kitchen table, the first time in 10 weeks that he'd sat at the kitchen table, and he put his hat on the surface in front of him and looked at it like it had something to tell him. She set coffee in front of him. She sat down across from him. She didn't say anything. She had learned from Russ, from Billy, from years of feeding people who were carrying things that sometimes the worst thing you can do for a person is fill the silence before they're ready. He drank the coffee. After a while he said, "The ranch has a debt." "All right," she said. "It was manageable 2 years ago. It's less manageable now." He turned the coffee cup in his hands. I borrowed money to expand the south pasture. Bad timing, a dry summer. Lost more head than I planned for. The man who holds the note wants the first major payment by spring. Can you make it? He was quiet for long enough that she had her answer before he gave it. Not without a hard winter, he said. And the signs aren't good. She looked at him. How as a man who had built this place from nothing. She was understanding had built it the way she'd built the boarding house, with his hands and his stubbornness and his refusal to accept that it wouldn't work. And now it was being threatened by something that hard work alone couldn't outrun, and he was sitting in her kitchen with his hat on the table because he didn't have anywhere else to put this. You haven't told the men, she said. No. Why not? Because they'll worry, and worried men make mistakes, and we can't afford mistakes right now. Cole. She said his name without thinking, and then almost took it back, and then decided not to. They're going to find out anyway. Men always know when something's wrong with the place they live. They just don't know the shape of it until someone tells them. He looked at her. And you think I should tell them the shape of it? I think, she said carefully, that a man who trusts his people with the truth is harder to beat than a man who carries it alone. He was quiet. My father used to do that, he said. Carry everything alone, right up until there was nothing left to carry. He paused. I swore I wouldn't be like him. You're not like him, she said. You're sitting at a kitchen table talking to someone about it. That's already different. Something in his face shifted. You have a way, he said slowly, of making the things I'm most afraid of seem like they might be manageable. They might be, she said. I don't know yet. But manageable things and unmanageable things often look identical before you start. He looked at her for a long moment. She held it. That look didn't deflect it, didn't smooth over it, didn't busy herself with something else the way she usually did when he looked at her with that particular quality of attention. Why are you not afraid? He asked. I am afraid, she said. I'm afraid every day. I'm just also very stubborn. He picked up the hat from the table and turned it in his hands. The south pasture, he said. There's still good grazing there. If we moved the herd early in spring, got them there before the other outfits, we'd have first pick. He was thinking out loud now, the words coming a little faster. And if we cut expenses this winter, not the food, I'm not touching the food, but other places. Equipment we can wait on. Repairs we can stretch. You'll need to be able to do the spring drive with fewer hands if you're cutting costs, she said. I know. So the hands you keep need to be in better condition than they've ever been. Stronger, healthier, more capable. She paused. That starts in the kitchen. He looked at her. She looked back at him. I can stretch the supplies further than I have been, she said, without the men noticing any difference in quality. I've been cooking for a boarding house full of men for 6 years. I know exactly how to feed 12 people on 10 people's budget without anyone losing strength. She paused. But I need you to tell me how bad it is. The real number, not the version you tell people to keep them calm. He told her. It was worse than she'd expected. She didn't let her face show it. All right, she said. Then let's start tomorrow. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said in a voice that was lower than his usual one, You don't have to do this. This isn't your debt. No, she said. But it's my ranch. She said it before she'd thought about saying it, and once it was out, she felt the full weight of what she'd said, my ranch, and what it meant that she'd said it. That somewhere in 10 weeks of breadboards and sage bundles and dining room laughter and 5-minute intervals of allowing herself to feel things she'd stopped expecting to feel, Silver Peak had stopped being a place she was staying and started being a place she belonged. Cole Walker looked at her with something in his face that she didn't have a name for. It was big and quiet and careful, like something that had been kept in a dark place for a long time and had just seen light for the first time. She looked away first. Drink your coffee, she said. I need to recalculate the supply orders. The next 4 weeks were the hardest of her time at Silver Peak, and they were also in a way she couldn't have predicted and wouldn't have chosen among the most important. She did what she'd told Cole she would do. stretched the supplies without diminishing the meals, applied every piece of knowledge she had about feeding people well, unless reorganized the storage to eliminate waste in ways she hadn't fully implemented before. She worked longer hours than she already had been, which had seemed impossible, and turned out not to be. She slept less. She thought more. She woke up at 2 in the morning sometimes with a solution to a problem she'd been turning over in her sleep, and lay there going through the logic of it until she was sure it worked. And she watched Cole Walker tell his men the truth. He called them together on a Wednesday evening after supper in the dining room. Evelyn stayed in the kitchen. She wasn't part of this. But the kitchen door was slightly open, and she heard it. The whole thing. Cole's voice steady and unsparing, laying out the situation without drama or deflection. The debt. The timeline. The plan. What he needed from each of them, and what he could promise in return. The silence that followed was different from the dining room silences she knew. It was dense thinking. Then Jerome said, "What do you need us to do?" And old Russ said, "I've been through worse, so has this ranch." And Billy said quietly, "We're not going anywhere, boss." One by one, she stood in the kitchen with her back against the work table and both hands flat on the surface, and let herself feel it, the full weight of what was happening in that room. These men choosing to stay, choosing to fight for something they believed in, and how that was inseparable from the fact that they'd been spending 10 weeks being fed by someone who reminded them 3 times a day that they were worth feeding well. She didn't think that was nothing. She thought it was possibly everything. Hank Dawson was the last one to speak. He said, "The cook's been stretching the supplies." The room went quiet in a different way. Evelyn went still. "She told you," Cole said. Not a question. "She told me nothing," Hank said. "But I do the supply orders, and I check the usage, and I know the numbers. She's been working with less for 3 weeks, and nobody's noticed because the food hasn't changed." A pause. "I don't know how she's doing it." Another silence. "She's better than I thought," Hank said finally, and each word seemed to cost him something specific. She heard it from the kitchen. She pressed her hands harder against the work table. Hank Dawson. Admitting he'd been wrong was not a small thing. She understood that, understood the scale of it in the particular economy of a man like Hank, for whom pride was not vanity, but armor, and the admission cost him something real. She wasn't foolish enough to think it resolved everything between them. But she also wasn't hard enough to dismiss it. She turned back to the stove and kept working. The real twist, the one that cracked everything open, came on a night in the 11th week in the last hour before midnight, when the ranch was completely silent. She had been in the cold storage doing a late inventory check, running her lamp along the shelves, making the calculations she'd been making every few days as their situation grew tighter. She was deep in concentration, adding figures in her head when she heard it. Footsteps in the barn above moving fast. Then voices, 2 of them low and sharp, cutting against each other. She went up the cellar stairs. She came through the barn door and stopped. Cole Walker and Hank Dawson were standing facing each other in the middle of the barn, and the quality of the air between them was the kind that makes the hairs on the back of your neck rise. She had been wrong about what she'd thought she understood. She had thought Hank's public admission at the ranch meeting had been the end of something. She could see now it had been the beginning. "It's not about the cook," Hank was saying. His voice was tight, controlled, like something being held down by force. It never was. "Then what is it about?" Cole said. "It's about the fact that you've changed." Hank's voice cracked on the last word, not with weakness, but with the particular fracture of a man saying something true that he's been refusing to say for a long time. "In 12 years, I've worked this ranch, I've never seen you sit at the kitchen table. I've never seen you give a damn what anybody thought of the food. I've never seen you watch someone across a dining room and then pretend you weren't watching." Cole said nothing. "She's made you different," Hank said. "And I don't know what to do with that. I don't know if it's good or if it's going to cost us." "It's already cost us something," Cole said, and his voice was very quiet. "Years of running a ranch that kept men alive without making them feel worth keeping." Hank was silent. "You know I value you," Cole said. 12 years doesn't disappear, but Evelyn Carter is not a threat to this ranch. She's possibly the best thing that's happened to it since I built the first fence post. And I need you to figure out a way to live with that." Evelyn hadn't moved. She was standing just inside the barn door, lamp in hand, invisible in the dark. She should have left. She knew she should have left the moment she understood what she was hearing. But her feet would not move. Because what Cole Walker had just said, the best thing that's happened to this ranch, was sitting in the center of her chest like a coal. Something small and hot and completely disorienting, and she could not have moved if she'd tried. Hank Dawson said, "I'm not good at admitting when I'm wrong." "I know," Cole said. "I was wrong about her." "I know that too." A long silence. "Then I reckon I've got some work to do," Hank said. He turned and walked toward the back of the barn and out the far door, and Evelyn pressed herself against the wall and held her breath, and he passed her without seeing her in the dark. She stood there for a long moment after he was gone. Then Cole said without turning around, "How much of that did you hear?" She closed her eyes briefly. "Enough," she said. He turned. He could see her by the lamp she was holding. She could see him by the same light, and there was nothing she could do about her face in that moment. Nothing she could arrange or manage, because she had used everything she had on keeping herself together for 11 weeks, and there was simply nothing left over for the particular task of pretending she hadn't just heard a man say she was the best thing that had happened to his ranch. "Evelyn," he said. "Don't," she said. "Please, just don't say anything right now." He didn't. He stood there and let her have the silence, and she was grateful for it in a way she couldn't articulate. Grateful that he was the kind of man who understood when a person needed to be given space to feel something without having to perform feeling it. After a while she said, "I wasn't eavesdropping." "I know you weren't." "I heard the footsteps, and I thought something was wrong." "Something was wrong," he said. "And then it got a little less wrong." She looked at him across the light. "I don't know what to do," she said, and she hadn't meant to say it, and once it was out, she couldn't take it back. "With any of this. I came here for a job. I asked for one night in a kitchen. I didn't ask for any of the rest of it." "I know," he said quietly. "I have spent my whole life being the person who takes care of everyone else. I know how to do that. I am excellent at that." She heard her own voice doing something she didn't intend, something frayed at the edges. "I don't know how to be the person that anyone." She stopped. She couldn't finish it. He walked toward her. Not fast, not with any kind of urgency, deliberately, the way he moved around the half-wild mare in the paddock, careful and sure, and giving her every chance to step back if she needed to. He stopped when there was still distance between them, enough distance that she didn't feel surrounded. He said, "You don't have to know how, you just have to stay." She looked at him. "Stay," he said. "Not because I'm asking you to cook. Not because the ranch needs you, though it does. Because this—" He stopped. He was not a man who found words easily, and she watched him work for them, the way she'd watched him work with difficult animals, with patient, careful effort. "Because whatever this is between us, it's the first thing I've felt in a very long time that I don't want to work around." The lamp was heavy in her hand. She said, "I'm not easy to be around. I know that. I have opinions about everything. I've noticed. I will argue with you about the supply orders. You already have, twice. And I was right both times." "You were right both times," he agreed. Despite everything, despite the weight of the evening and the close walls of the barn and the enormous frightening thing that was pressing against the inside of her chest, she almost laughed. She felt it rise in her throat, and she held it there. "Cole," she said. "Yes, I need you to give me some time." He didn't hesitate. "You've got all the time there is." She looked at him for a long moment in the lamplight. Then she said good night and went back to the kitchen. She sat at the work table in the dark, didn't light another lamp, just sat, and she breathed. In and out. Slow. The way she'd taught herself to breathe in difficult moments over years. The rhythm that had gotten her through the bank notice on the boarding house door, and the 3 towns that turned her away, and the 4 days of walking, and the dirt-covered spoon in the yard at Silver Peak. She thought about the girl she'd been at 18, standing in her mother's kitchen, learning the weight of a wooden spoon and the patience of bread dough. Listening to her mother say, "The person you feed is the person you love." It had taken her 27 years to understand that the sentence ran in both directions. Feeding was not just giving. Sometimes it was also receiving. Sometimes the thing you fed others was the same hunger you were carrying in yourself, and the only way to fill it was to finally stop pretending you didn't have it. She had been pretending for a long time. She sat in the dark kitchen of Silver Peak Ranch and she stopped pretending. She was still sitting there an hour later when the first sounds of the storm arrived. Not rain yet, just wind, the kind that comes before everything else, the kind that announces that something large is on its way. She got up. She went to the storage. She started counting what they had. Because she had been preparing for this quietly, methodically, in the background of every other thing she'd done for 11 weeks. And if the storm was coming, she intended to be ready for it. She always intended to be ready. The question was whether she'd prepared enough. She counted the shelves in the dark, lamp in hand, running her thumb across the ledger entries, checking the numbers against what she could see with her own eyes. And she was halfway through the inventory when Billy appeared at the top of the cellar stairs with his coat half on and his hair still flat from sleep. "Storm's coming," he said. "I know," she said. "Bad one. Russ says he can feel it." "Russ is right." "Miss Evelyn." He hesitated. "Are we going to be okay?" She looked at him, this boy with his soft face and his early mornings and his armfuls of firewood and his coffee cups and everything. He'd been becoming over 11 weeks of someone paying attention to him. "Yes," she said, without hesitation. "Because some things you say, not because you're certain, but because the person asking needs the ground to be solid, and making the ground solid is something you can do right now, which is the only moment that ever actually exists." "Yes," she said again. "We are going to be okay." The wind picked up outside. Evelyn Carter closed her ledger, lifted her lamp, and went upstairs to start preparing. Part 4. The storm hit Silver Peak Ranch at 3 in the morning, and it hit like it meant to end something. Evelyn heard it before she felt it, a sound like the whole mountain had decided to lean on the ranch all at once, wind driving hard against the walls, the roof groaning under the weight of what was falling. She was already awake. She had not gone to bed. She had spent the hours after midnight doing what she always did when she knew something was coming. She prepared. The kitchen fire was burning high and steady. Every pot she owned was filled or heating. The bread she'd set to rise before midnight had been punched down and set again because instinct told her the men were going to need something warm to come back to before this was over. The supply inventory she'd finished in the cellar was memorized. She knew exactly what they had, exactly how long it would last, exactly where every contingency stood. She heard Cole's voice in the yard before she heard the bunkhouse door. He was already organizing, calling names, assigning directions, his voice cutting through the wind, with the particular authority of a man who does not raise his volume, but somehow makes himself heard anyway. She listened to him through the kitchen wall and felt something settle in her chest. Not comfort exactly, but the particular steadiness of being near someone who does not panic, even when the situation earns it. Billy came through the kitchen door first. Snow on his shoulders and his face red from the cold, stamping his boots. "Supply lines are buried," he said. "Route to town is gone. Russ says it could be 3 days before we can get anything in or out." "3 days is fine," Evelyn said. She handed him a mug of coffee before he'd finished the sentence. "Drink this, then go back out and tell whoever's working the north side that I need someone to check the water barrel situation before the pipes freeze." He drank half the coffee in one go. "You're not worried." "I didn't say that. I said 3 days is fine. I can feed 12 men for 10 days on what's in that cellar." She turned back to the stove. "Now go." He went. The storm did what Montana storms do. It committed. It didn't gust and retreat. It settled in like something that had decided this was where it lived now, packing snow against every door and window with a relentless, heavy patience. By 5 in the morning, the bunkhouse door required 2 men to open. By 7, the visibility was nothing, and the men who had to move between buildings moved in pairs. Rope between them because the distance between the barn and the bunkhouse had become the kind of distance where you could lose a person. Evelyn ran the kitchen like a command post. She cooked in shifts, something hot available every hour. The rotation of what she prepared calculated so that nothing was wasted and nothing ran out faster than her projections said it should. She sent food to the barn for the men working with the horses. She sent food to whoever was reinforcing the roof over the supply shed. She tracked every portion, every ounce of firewood used for cooking, versus heating every cup of flour against her ledger and her day's remaining calculation. She did not sit down. She did not slow down. She did not allow herself to feel the tiredness until she'd found a stopping point, which never arrived. So the tiredness just kept accumulating somewhere behind her eyes, and she kept ignoring it. Old Russ came in from the cold at 8 in the morning with ice in his beard and sat at the kitchen table and looked at the mug she'd put in front of him without her asking. "You knew," he said. "You started laying in for this before any of us." "I suspected," she said. "How long ago?" 5 weeks. He looked at her. "The supply patterns," she said. "The temperature at night. The way the horses were behaving in the mornings. A hard winter doesn't arrive suddenly. It announces itself if you're paying attention." 5 weeks, Russ said again. He turned the mug slowly in his hands. "And you didn't tell anyone?" "I told Cole." He was quiet for a moment. He knew. He knew I was concerned. I didn't want to alarm the men without more certainty, and I needed time to build the reserve without anyone noticing we were building a reserve, because if the men know you're preparing for the worst starts to feel inevitable. Russ was looking at her with an expression she recognized. She'd seen versions of it before on Billy, on Jerome, on Garrett after he recovered. It was the expression of a person recalibrating, adjusting their understanding of what they'd been looking at. "You've been managing this whole ranch," he said. "Not just the kitchen." "I've been managing the kitchen," she said firmly. Everything else was just adjacent. I made a sound that was somewhere between a grunt and a laugh. "That's one word for it." Cole came in from the storm at 9:30, covered in snow, and he stood in the kitchen doorway, pulling off his gloves and looking at the organized, running, hot, functional command post that Evelyn had made of his kitchen, and his expression did the thing she'd seen it do before. In big moments, it went very still. "How are we doing?" he said. "We're fine," she said. "The north water barrel is close to freezing, but Jerome wrapped it with the extra blankets I left near the barn door last week. The food situation is solid. The fire in the bunkhouse is burning clean, because I had Billy clear the chimney flue 2 days ago." She handed him coffee. "Eat something." He sat down at the kitchen table. He ate what she put in front of him. He didn't speak for several minutes, and she let him have that. Let him come in from whatever he'd been carrying out in the cold, and set it down for a few minutes. Then he said, "The south fence is gone." She stopped. Completely. 3 sections. Wind took them in the night. The herd. Contained. Barely. He drank the coffee. "We'll lose the fence materials. Can't replace them until spring. Can you build temporary barriers?" "With what's already on the ranch, yes. Takes 2 days of work when the storm breaks." "Then that's what we do." She turned back to the stove. "Spring isn't as far away as it feels right now." He was quiet. Then, "Hank's handling the barn rotation. Good work out there." She didn't look up. "Hank knows this ranch better than anyone. He should be handling it." She felt him watching her. "You're not going to say anything about it," he said. "About what you heard last night." "I said what I needed to say last night," she said. "And you said what you needed to say. The storm came, and now there's work to do. That's all there is right now. And after the storm..." She considered the bread dough she was turning. "After the storm, we'll see." It was the most she could give him honestly, and he seemed to understand that because he nodded and finished his coffee and went back out into the cold. The storm lasted 3.5 days. Not 3 days, as Russ had predicted, but 3.5. The additional half being what she calculated as the storm's way of reminding everyone that it made its own decisions. The men rotated through the kitchen in waves. They ate. They warmed up. They went back out. They came back. The rhythm of it became over the 3 days, something almost like a heartbeat, steady, necessary, each pulse keeping the whole organism alive. She watched things happen in that kitchen that she hadn't expected. On the second day, Hank Dawson came in from a rotation looking more exhausted than she'd seen anyone look in weeks, and he sat at the table and put his head in his hands for a moment before he noticed she was watching. He straightened up immediately. She put food in front of him without a word. He ate it. Then he said into the surface of the table, "Those supplies you had laid in. The ones I found when I was checking the cellar inventory last month." "Yes," she said. "I told Cole there was a discrepancy. I thought—" He stopped. "I thought you were taking things, skimming." She went still. "I reported it," he said, "to Cole, before the ranch meeting." She didn't speak. "He told me he knew about the reserve, that you'd told him, that it was deliberate." Hank's jaw moved. "He let me figure out the rest." "Which was," she said quietly. "Which was that I was looking for a reason," Hank said. He got each word out like it was costing him. "I was looking for something to find wrong with you, and I found the one thing that was most right about you and tried to make it look like theft." He pushed the empty plate away from him. "That's a sorry way to behave." The silence in the kitchen was enormous. "Yes," she said. "It is. I'm sorry, Miss Carter." She looked at him, this broad, thick-necked man, with his small, fast eyes, and his 12 years, and his pride that had cost him and her both something real. She looked at him, and she did not have the energy in the middle of a 3-day storm, with everything she'd been carrying for 11 weeks, to be anything other than honest. "I know why you did it," she said. "I don't mean the skimming accusation. I mean all of it. From the beginning." He looked up at her. "I arrived here, and I didn't fit anything you expected," she said. "I didn't look the way you expected. I didn't behave the way you expected. And the men started to change, and the ranch started to feel different. And that was threatening to someone who'd built his place here over 12 years and knew exactly where everything stood and what everything meant." She paused. "I understand that. I don't agree with how you handled it, but I understand why." He was quiet for a long time. "That's more grace than I've shown you," he said finally. "Yes," she said. "It is." He absorbed that without flinching. "I'll do better," he said. "I know you will," she said, and she meant it. He picked up his hat and went back out into the storm. She stood at the work table afterward and breathed. Just breathed. 12 weeks of tension between herself and Hank Dawson, and it had come to this, a man eating her food and saying he'd been wrong, and her saying she knew why, and both of them meaning it. It wasn't a reconciliation exactly. It was the beginning of one, which was all any reconciliation ever was at the start. The mini-crisis that arrived on the 3rd day was quieter and more dangerous. She ran out of sugar. In any other context, it was nothing. On day 3 of a storm with 12 men depending on something warm and good. At the end of every brutally cold rotation, it was the difference between morale and the specific gray exhaustion that sets into men who have been working hard in the cold with nothing sweet at the end of it. She stood in the kitchen and looked at her stores and thought. Then she went to the cellar and came back with the jar of wild plum preserves she'd put up in September, the only jar from the small harvest she'd found on the south slope, which she'd been saving without entirely knowing why. She found a portion of cornmeal she'd been using for other things. She found the last of the dried apple and the molasses tin. She made something that wasn't any one thing, not cake, not bread, not pie, but something in between, something warm and sweet and unmistakably good that came out of the oven in the middle of the afternoon of the 3rd day when the men were at their lowest. Billy brought the first piece to old Russ. Russ tasted it. He said, "She made something out of nothing again." Jerome, who was sitting across from him with his elbows on the table, said, "She always makes something out of nothing. That's the whole point of her." Evelyn heard it from the kitchen. She pressed her hands flat against the work table and stayed there for a moment. That's the whole point of her. She thought about the boarding house, about the bank, about 3 towns and 10,000 steps and a dirt-covered spoon. She thought about the girl who'd stood on a step stool learning that food was the thing that said you are here, you are seen, you are worth feeding. She thought about 12 weeks of being afraid that she would give everything she had and still not be enough. Jerome had no idea what he'd just said to her. She pulled herself together and kept working. The storm broke on the morning of the 4th day. Not gradually. Montana storms don't break. Gradually, they end the way they begin, decisively and without apology. 1 hour, it was still driving snow. The next, the wind was gone, and the sky was the clean, merciless blue that only exists after something hard. The men came out of the bunkhouse blinking. The damage was real. 3 sections of south fence, part of the roof over the smaller storage shed. Storage shed, a section of the corral gate that had given under the weight of accumulated ice. All of it fixable. None of it fatal. Cole stood in the yard assessing it, and Evelyn watched him from the kitchen door with her apron on, and her hair escaping from its pins, the way it always did after 3 days of working without stopping, and she watched his face move through the calculation. This is what we lost. This is what remains. This is what we have to work with and land on something that was not defeat. He turned and saw her in the doorway. He looked at her for a moment. Then he said across the yard, just loud enough to reach her, "We made it." "We did," she said. He held her eyes for 1 more second, and then the men were around him, and the work of the morning began, and she went back inside to start breakfast. She was at the stove when Hank Dawson came through the kitchen door at a pace that was not his usual pace. He stopped just inside the door. "Cole needs you," he said. She turned. The way he'd said it, the pitch of it was wrong. "What happened?" "Man came in from the East Road. Rode through the storm's tail end. He's from the land office in Billings." Hank's face was very still. "He's here about the note." She took off her apron. She went. The man from the land office was sitting in Cole's office, a room she'd been in exactly twice with his hat on his knee, and the look of a man who has delivered bad news enough times to have developed a professional neutrality about it. Cole was standing behind his desk. He didn't sit. Evelyn came in and stood to the side. She hadn't been asked. She'd come because Hank had said Cole needs you, and she had decided to take that literally. Cole glanced at her when she entered. He didn't tell her to leave. The man from the land office looked at her briefly, with the automatic assessment of a man encountering something unexpected, and then looked back at Cole. "The note holder has moved up the timeline," he said. "The spring payment was previously agreed for late April. He's requesting full settlement by the 1st of March. The room went very quiet. "That's 6 weeks, Cole said. "Yes, sir." "The reason?" "He's selling the note to a Denver concern. They're consolidating several land holdings in the territory. They want clean books before the transfer." Cole's jaw was tight. His hands were flat on the desk. He was doing the same thing she'd watched him do in the storm, holding himself very still while he worked through it, not letting the thing overwhelm him before he'd finished calculating it. "The full amount," he said. "Yes, sir, or the land office begins proceedings on the lien." "On the south pasture?" "Yes, sir, and potentially the main structures depending on the valuation." Silence. Evelyn looked at Cole. I was not looking at her. He was looking at the man from the land office with the careful, controlled expression of a man determining whether the ground he's standing on is solid enough to bear the next step. She did something then that she hadn't planned. She said, "Is there a provision for partial payment?" Both men looked at her. The land office man said with the slightly cautious politeness of someone who is not sure who he's speaking to, "Ma'am." "In the note," she said. "Is there a provision for partial payment with a documented plan for the remainder? Because if there is, we can make a substantial payment by the 1st of March and present a spring drive projection that demonstrates the remainder." The man opened his satchel. He went through the papers with the methodical care of a man whose job depends on accuracy. He found the clause. He read it. He looked up. "There is a provision," he said slowly. "It's at the note holder's discretion, but it's there." She looked at Cole. Cole looked at her. In that look was something enormous and unspoken, all 12 weeks of it. Every breadboard and sage bundle and late-night corridor conversation and barn door moment and 3.5-day storm compressed into 2 seconds of eye contact in a room with a land office man and a document that might have just given them a chance. "Get me the numbers," Cole said to the man. "What constitutes substantial?" The man told him. Cole looked at his desk. He was calculating. She could see him doing it the same way she calculated supply ledgers, running the figures, testing the margins. He looked up at her. She said quietly, "I know." Because she did know. She'd been carrying the ranch numbers in her head since he'd told her the real amount since the night in the kitchen, when she'd said it's my ranch and meant it. She had been turning the math over for weeks in the mornings before the stove was lit and the nights after the fire was banked. The reserve we've been building, she said. It's not enough by itself, but I know how to stretch the spring supplies to a skeleton budget that'll free up another. She named a figure. His eyes widened slightly. And if the South Drive goes early, she continued, before the Hendersons and the Carver outfit get their herds moving, you're first to market and you command better price. By how much? She told him. He looked at the man from the land office. He named a number. The partial payment amount. The documented projection. The man looked at his papers. He said, I'd have to take this back to Billings, but I believe the note holder, the current note holder before the transfer, would consider this favorably. He's a businessman, not a... He paused. He wants the money, not the land. When do you need an answer? Cole said. 2 weeks. You'll have it in 1. The man from the land office picked up his hat, nodded to Cole, nodded to Evelyn with a slightly different quality of acknowledgement than he'd given her when she first came in, something more careful, more considered, and left. The office was very quiet. Cole sat down behind his desk. He put his elbows on the surface and pressed both hands against his face for a moment, just one moment, and then dropped them. The figure you named, he said. The spring supplies projection. You've been running that math. For 5 weeks, she said. He looked at her. The same 5 weeks you were building the storm reserve. Approximately. Evelyn. His voice had gone to that lower register, the one she'd only heard a few times, and which always meant he was about to say something he'd been working up to. What exactly do you think your job is here? She considered the question. Whatever the ranch needs, she said. He shook his head slowly. Not in disagreement, in something more like wonder. I hired you to cook meals. You hired me to make 1 meal, she corrected. The rest developed. The rest, he said, has saved this ranch twice by my count, possibly 3 times if this works. She didn't say anything. I need to ask you something, he said. All right. The money you've been putting aside since your first month here, your savings. He held up a hand before she could speak. I'm not asking you to give it. I'm not asking you for anything. I need you to understand that before I ask the question. She waited. Is it enough to be part of the partial payment, combined with the reserve and the projection? Would it get us to the number? She knew the answer immediately. She'd done the math that morning in the cellar in the dark before she'd known the timeline had moved. She'd done it because she'd suspected something was coming, and she'd wanted to know what she had to work with. She said, yes. He went very still. Evelyn, I cannot ask you. You didn't ask me, she said. I'm telling you. You worked for that money. You sent most of your first savings to your sister. What's left is enough, she said. And yes, I worked for it. I worked for it here on this ranch in this kitchen. It seems right that it stays here. That is not how money works, he said. It's how this money works, she said. He was looking at her with that expression, the one from the lamplight in the barn, the one she didn't have a name for, the enormous, quiet, careful one. I don't know how to accept this from you, he said. You accepted it when you put money on my kitchen counter for my sister, she said. Now you know what it felt like. He breathed out. She watched the breath go. Watched something in his shoulders change, something that had been held for weeks release a little. It's a loan, he said, with interest, proper legal documentation. Fine, she said. Write it up. You're the most stubborn person I've ever met, he said. Yes, she said. You've been benefiting from that for 12 weeks. And then he did something she hadn't seen him do before. Not the almost smile, not the quick, invisible shift. He laughed. An actual, real, surprised laugh, low and short, but completely genuine, and it changed his whole face for the 3 seconds it lasted. She felt it land somewhere she wasn't ready for. She looked away. She said, I need to get back to the kitchen. There's breakfast still to be dealt with. Of course there is, he said. And she could hear in his voice that the laugh was still somewhere nearby. She went back to the kitchen. She stood at the stove. Her hands were not shaking this time. They were steady. She noticed that. After every other high-stakes moment in this kitchen, they'd shaken the adrenaline finding its way out through her palms. This time, they were completely still. She thought about that for a moment. Then she started the eggs. Billy appeared at 9:30 with a message she hadn't expected. He came in with the particular energy of someone carrying something significant and not sure whether it was good or bad news. "Man from the land office stopped me on his way out," he said. She turned. "He said to tell you." Billy checked like he was making sure he had it right. That he'd seen a lot of ranch operations in distress situations, and he'd never seen a cook present a spring drive financial projection before. She waited. "He said he meant it as a compliment," Billy added, in case that wasn't clear. She turned back to the eggs. "Tell him he's welcome to the bread recipe if he wants it," she said. Billy laughed. She didn't, but it was close. What happened that afternoon? What she didn't see coming. What nobody saw coming arrived in the form of a letter. Not from Margaret this time. From a woman in Billings named Mrs. Helen Ford, who was the wife of the man who held Cole's note. Evelyn didn't know the name. Cole knew the name, and when she brought him the letter, misdelivered to the kitchen where the supply rider had left it, assuming it was general ranch correspondence, his face did something complicated. She held it out. He didn't take it immediately. "This is from Helen Ford," he said. "He said the name the way you say a name that has history in it." "I don't know who that is," she said. He stopped. "Her husband holds the note. But Helen and I grew up in the same territory, years ago." He paused. "Before this ranch. Before a lot of things." He took the letter. He read it. She watched his face, and his face told her nothing, which meant it was significant. "She's going to be in the territory next month," he said. "She wants to meet." "About the note." "She doesn't say." He folded the letter, set it on the desk. "Helen Ford has never done anything without a reason." Evelyn looked at him. "Is she a problem?" she said. He met her eyes. "She might be something I don't have a category for yet," he said. She held his gaze. "Then we'll deal with it when it arrives," she said. She left the office. She went back to the kitchen, and she stood at the work table, and she was honest with herself in the way she made herself be honest when the alternative was pretending about what she'd felt in that moment. When he'd said Helen Ford's name with 12 years of history sitting behind it. When he'd said she might be something he didn't have a category for. She had felt something cold move through her. She had felt it, and she had noted it, and she had walked herself through it with the same steady practical attention she gave to everything. She was not nothing to Cole Walker. She knew that. She also knew that she was a woman who had arrived at this ranch with a leather bag and a split boot and no promises, and that she had been building something here for 12 weeks on a foundation of hard work and stubbornness, and the hope that this time, this one time, it would be enough. And that was not the same as having it be enough. Not yet. She made dinner that evening with everything she had. She made it the way she made things when she needed to remind herself why she was here. Not for approval, not for safety, not because she had nowhere else to go anymore, but because this was what she was. This was the fullest expression of what she knew how to do, and she was done apologizing for it. The men ate. The dining room was the loudest it had been since before the storm. Old Russ told a story that made Jerome laugh hard enough to nearly fall off his bench. Billy ate 3 helpings. Garrett, fully recovered, said it was the best meal he'd had since he was 16 years old at his mother's table. Hank Dawson ate quietly. But before he left the table, he paused at the kitchen door and said, "Good meal, Miss Carter." 3 words. She had waited 12 weeks for 3 words from Hank Dawson. She said, "Thank you, Mr. Dawson." He nodded and went. She stood in the kitchen afterward, alone, listening to the sounds of the ranch settling into the evening horses. Windmen's voices diminishing toward the bunkhouse, the specific quiet of a place that has come through something and is resting. She looked at her hands. Steady. Still. She had come here asking for one night in a kitchen. She had gotten 12 weeks of the hardest, realest, most completely lived experience of her adult life. And Helen Ford was coming. and the note was still outstanding. And Cole Walker had laughed in his office that afternoon for the first time in God only knew how long. And Evelyn Carter stood in her kitchen at Silver Peak Ranch, and felt the ground under her feet, and it was solid, and she had put it there herself, one meal at a time, one stubborn day at a time, and nothing, and no one was going to take it from her without a fight. She intended to win. She banked the fire. She went to bed. For the first time in 12 weeks, she slept all the way through the night. Part 5. Helen Ford arrived on a Tuesday. Evelyn knew she was coming before the horse reached the gate, not because anyone told her, but because Cole had been different that morning. Not worse, not distant, just slightly more contained than usual, like a man who has put everything in careful order before someone arrives to inspect it. He'd come through the kitchen at his usual time, said his usual morning, and tipped his hat. But the hat tip had lasted a half-second longer than it normally did, and he'd held her eyes just a beat past comfortable, and she'd understood without either of them saying a word that today was the day. She made a good breakfast. Not a showy breakfast. She wasn't performing anything for anyone, but a thorough one. The kind that set men up for hard work and hard weather, and whatever else the day decided to throw at them. She worked steadily, and didn't allow herself to think about Helen Ford. She thought about Helen Ford constantly. Billy came in at 8:30 with the look he always had when he was carrying information he wasn't sure he should share. "She's here," he said. "I know," Evelyn said. "She came with two people, a man who works for her husband, and a woman who I think is her companion." He paused. She's very put together, Miss Evelyn." Evelyn turned the bread she was working. "That's fine, Billy." "I just thought you should." "Billy." She looked at him. "I am not in a competition with Helen Ford. I don't know the woman. Whatever her history is with this ranch is not my business. My business is this kitchen." She held his gaze. "Go eat your breakfast." He went. She stood at the work table and was honest with herself for exactly 30 seconds, because that was all she could afford. She was afraid. Not the productive kind of fear she'd learned to use as fuel. The other kind. The old kind that lived in the part of her that remembered every time she'd built something and watched it come apart. The part that had spent a lifetime being told she was not the kind of woman men chose when they had other choices available. 30 seconds. Then she turned back to the bread, and she worked. She did not meet Helen Ford until the afternoon. Cole came to the kitchen at noon and said he'd be eating with his guest in the main house, and Evelyn prepared a proper meal for 3 and sent it over with Billy. And that was the full extent of her involvement in the first 4 hours of Helen Ford's visit. It was Hank who told her. He came into the kitchen at 2 o'clock with his hat in his hands. He'd developed the habit of removing his hat when he came to speak with her, which she'd noticed, and which she understood as the thing it was, and he sat down at the table and said without preamble, "She's not here about the note." Evelyn turned. "Cole spoke to her husband last week," Hank said. "By letter. The partial payment was accepted. The projection satisfied them. The Denver concern is taking the note but agreed to the modified timeline." He paused. "We have until June, not March." She sat down. She hadn't meant to. Her knees made the decision before her mind did. "Since when?" she said. "Cole knew before she arrived. He was going to tell you today. He wanted to, I don't know. He wanted to tell you himself." "Then why are you telling me?" she said. Hank looked at her steadily. "Because she asked to meet you," he said. "Helen Ford. She specifically asked Cole to introduce her to his cook. And I thought you should know the note situation before you walked into that conversation, so you weren't carrying it." Evelyn looked at him. This man who had thrown a spoon in the dirt, who had reported her to Cole for suspected theft, who had said things about her size and her worth that had reached her through Billy's careful, sorry-faced delivery. He was sitting at her kitchen table with his hat in his hands, making sure she didn't walk into a difficult conversation without the information she needed. "Thank you, Hank," she said. He nodded once, put his hat on, left. She sat at the table for another full minute. Then she stood up, straightened her apron, checked her hair, and went to meet Helen Ford. Helen Ford was exactly what Billy had meant by very put together. She was 40, perhaps a few years past, with the particular kind of groomed elegance that came from money applied tastefully, and a woman who had never spent 4 days working a storm without sleep. She was handsome, not beautiful features too sharp for soft prettiness, but arranged with a confidence that made you think beauty was beside the point. She was sitting in the main room of the ranch house with a cup of coffee and an ease in Cole's space that told Evelyn something about the history Billy had tried to warn her about. Cole was standing when Evelyn came in. He said, "Evelyn, this is Helen Ford." Helen Ford looked at her. It was a thorough look, not unkind, but honest, the look of a woman taking a full accounting. It lasted 2 seconds and then was done. "Miss Carter," she said, "Cole has been telling me about you." "Mrs. Ford," Evelyn said, "I hope the meal was adequate." "It was exceptional," Helen said. "The bread especially. Sit down, please." Evelyn sat. Helen looked at Cole briefly, a look that passed something between them, something with years in it, and then looked back at Evelyn. "I'm going to be direct," she said. "I find it saves time." "So do I," Evelyn said. Something shifted in Helen Ford's expression, something that might have been approval. "I came because my husband's business brought me to the territory, and I told him if I was making the trip, I wanted to see Silver Peak. I've heard about it for years." She set her coffee cup down. "I've known Cole Walker since we were both young enough to be foolish, and I've watched him build this ranch from nothing, and I've watched him do it alone in a way that wasn't good for him." She paused. "When his letters started changing, my husband noticed the financials. I noticed the tone." Evelyn didn't speak. "The letters started sounding like someone who had something worth protecting again," Helen said. "Not just the land, something more specific than land." She looked at Evelyn with the directness she'd promised. "I wanted to see what had changed." The room was very quiet. Cole said from where he was standing, "Helen." "I'm being honest," she said to him. "You know I'm always honest." She looked back at Evelyn. "You're not what I expected." "People rarely are," Evelyn said. "No," Helen said. "But specifically Cole described you as his cook. His letters mentioned efficiency and the men's morale and food supply management." She paused. "He didn't mention that you'd restructured his financial approach to the note, or identified the storm risk 5 weeks in advance, or essentially been running the operational side of this ranch alongside the kitchen." A pause. "I think he may have been protecting something. I'm not sure what." Evelyn looked at Cole. He was looking at the middle distance in the particular way of a man who has been accurately described and is deciding how to feel about it. "I cook," Evelyn said. "Everything else is adjacent." Helen Ford looked at her for a long moment. Then she laughed, a genuine laugh, short and surprised. "He told me you'd say something exactly like that," she said. "Word for word almost." The afternoon changed after that. Helen Ford was underneath the elegant surface, a practical woman with a sharp mind and no patience for pretense, and Evelyn respected both of those things. They actually talked in the way that two women talk when they've both decided the other one is worth taking seriously about the ranch, about the territory, about what it meant to build something in a place that didn't make building easy. Cole largely let them. He refilled the coffee once and stayed quiet, and watched in the way he watched things he was trying to understand. At one point, Helen said to Evelyn, "You know what he's like. When he trusts something, he trusts it completely. And when he's afraid of something, he works around it for years before he addresses it." She wasn't looking at Cole when she said it. She was looking at Evelyn. "I spent 2 years waiting for him to address it. I married someone else, and that turned out to be exactly right. But the waiting—" She stopped. "I'm telling you this because I think you should know what you're dealing with," Cole said very quietly. "Helen." "She should know," Helen said, simply, without cruelty. "You're not 20 anymore, Cole. Neither is she. And some things shouldn't take as long as they take, because someone is afraid." The room held that. Evelyn felt it land somewhere specific. Felt the weight of it, the particular thing Helen Ford had just done, not in malice, not in competition, but in the honest way of a woman who had lived something and was offering the knowledge of it to someone younger who hadn't yet. She looked at Cole. He was looking at her. His face was doing something it had never done in the 12 weeks she'd known him. It was completely unguarded. No management. No careful containment. Just the thing itself, whatever it was, right there on the surface. She looked away. She looked at Helen Ford. She said, "Thank you for telling me." Helen nodded once, picked up her coffee. "Now," she said, "tell me about the spring drive projection. I want to understand how you got to those numbers." And just like that, the conversation moved the way conversations do when important things have been said and acknowledged, and the only dignified thing left is to continue. Helen Ford left the following morning. She shook Evelyn's hand at the gate, a firm, direct handshake, the kind that means something, and she said, "The bread recipe. Would you consider writing it down?" "I'll think about it," Evelyn said. Helen smiled. "Tell him before June," she said, quietly, so only Evelyn could hear. "Don't make him wait until June." Then she rode out. Cole stood at the gate watching the road for a moment after she'd gone. Then he turned and went toward the barn without a word. Evelyn went back to the kitchen. She made lunch. She was cleaning up the midday dishes when he appeared in the kitchen doorway, not at his usual time. Not for coffee, just there, the way he'd been appearing for 12 weeks at moments she hadn't anticipated. "She liked you," he said. "I liked her," Evelyn said. "She doesn't like most people." "I know," she told me. I was quiet. She heard him come into the kitchen, heard his boots on the floor, the specific sound of him moving into her space, and she kept her hands in the washing water and kept her breathing even. He stopped beside her, not behind her. Beside her, close enough that she could see his hands at the edge of her vision, his hat turning slowly between them. "I have been," he said, "afraid." She didn't speak. "Not of the debt, not of the storm, not of anything I can work against with my hands." He stopped. The words were costing him something. She could hear it in the measured pace of them. "I have been afraid of wanting something I might not be allowed to have." She took her hands out of the water. She turned. I was looking at her with that expression, the enormous, quiet, careful one that she'd never found a name for, and this time she didn't look away from it. She held it. She let it be what it was. "Cole," she said. "I know I'm not easy," he said. "I know I work too much and say too little, and I spent too many years alone to be entirely fixed about it." "I know," she said, "and you have opinions about everything." "I told you that myself," she said, "and you'll argue with me about the supply orders." "I'll always be right about the supply orders." "You are always right about the supply orders," he said, and that almost smile was there, and behind it something enormous and real and completely unguarded. "Evelyn Carter, I have 11 weeks of evidence that this ranch is better because you're in it, and 2 more weeks of evidence that I am better because you're in it, and I would very much like to stop working around that and say it plainly." She looked at him. She thought about the boarding house, about the bank notice, about 3 towns and 10,000 steps, about a dirt-covered spoon and 1 night in a kitchen and what it had turned into. She thought about her mother saying the person you feed is the person you love. She thought about 12 weeks of doors she'd been opening one at a time and what she'd found behind everyone. She said, "I came here with nothing." "I know," he said. "I came here because I had nowhere else to go, and I needed work, and I was willing to prove myself one more time, even though I was exhausted from proving myself my whole life." "I know that too," he said, "and somewhere in the middle of all of it." She stopped. She breathed. "I stopped just surviving here. I started living here. And that—" Her voice did the thing she hadn't wanted it to do, the rough, honest thing. "That is the most frightening thing that has happened to me in a very long time." He reached out. He took one of her hands carefully, the way he did everything with full attention and no rush, and he held it in both of his. She felt the calluses on his palms, the warmth of his hands, the complete steadiness of them. "You don't have to stop being afraid," he said. "You just have to stay." He'd said it before, in the barn weeks ago. She'd said she needed time, and he'd said, "You've got all the time there is," and she had taken the time, and she had used it, and here was the end of it. "I'm staying," she said. Simple, complete. the two most important words she'd said in 12 weeks. He let out a breath that she understood had been held for longer than 12 weeks, held possibly for years, for all the long solitary time before she'd shown up at his gate with a leather bag and a split boot and an offer to cook one meal. He didn't rush what came next. He was not a man who rushed anything. He raised her hand and held it against his chest for a moment. Just that, just the warmth of it. The simplicity of two people who have been through something real, standing close and acknowledging it. She felt his heartbeat under her palm. Steady, strong, real. The twist arrived 3 days later, and it arrived in a form she genuinely had not anticipated. Margaret came. Not a letter. Margaret herself. Her sister arriving at Silver Peak on the afternoon stage connection thinner than Evelyn remembered, and with something different behind her eyes that said she'd been through the fire she'd described in her letter and had come out the other side, changed but intact. She stood at the ranch gate with one bag, and the family nose, and the specific expression of a woman who is not entirely sure of her welcome, but has run out of alternatives. Evelyn saw her from the kitchen window. She was outside the door before Margaret had taken 3 steps up the path. They collided somewhere in the middle. No elegant reunion, just two women holding each other hard, the way sisters hold each other when enough time has passed and enough has happened, that the holding itself is the whole conversation. Margaret said into her shoulder, "I'm sorry, I had nowhere." "Stop," Evelyn said. "Stop. You're here." She brought Margaret inside. She fed her. Because that was what she did. That was how she loved people always had been. She put something warm in front of them and said, "You are here, you are seen, you are worth feeding." Margaret ate and slowly came back to herself, the way people come back to themselves after hard seasons, gradually, incrementally, with the specific color returning to a face that has been gray for too long. Cole met her that evening. He shook her hand. Said it was a pleasure, meant it in the direct, uncomplicated way. He meant everything, and said she was welcome at Silver Peak for as long as she needed. That was it. No performance, no conditions, no deliberation. Evelyn watched him say it, and felt something move through her that was larger than anything she had language for. Margaret looked at her afterward, when Cole had gone back to the evening work, and said, "Tell me about him." Evelyn said, "I came here to cook one meal." Margaret looked around the kitchen, the organized shelves, the good fire, the breadboard, the ledger on the work table, the deep settled warmth of a space that had been cared for properly and over time. "Evelyn," Margaret said, "you built a home." She said it simply, like it was the obvious thing, which maybe it was. Evelyn looked at the kitchen. She thought about the first morning, the spoiled flour, the badly stored meat, the cold and the dirt-covered spoon. She thought about Billy's first cup of coffee, and old Russ's quiet words about his wife, and Garrett standing in the doorway with his hat off, and the 3.5-day storm, and the land office man, and the breadboard, and the sage bundle, and Cole Walker's hands holding hers with his heartbeat steady underneath. "Yes," she said. "I suppose I did." The spring drive happened in late April. Cole took the herd out early, as Evelyn had projected, and got to market ahead of the other outfits, and the price he commanded was within a margin of what she'd estimated, that she was quietly, privately very pleased about. The debt payment was made. The note was satisfied ahead of the modified timeline ahead of it, which she had also projected was possible. If the drive went well, and it had gone well, because she had fed those men through a Montana winter, and they had gone into the drive in better condition than any of them had been in years. The land office man sent a letter. It said, among other things, the note has been settled in full. Silver Peak Ranch holds clear title to all described parcels. Cole read it at the kitchen table. He set it down. He looked at Evelyn. She said, "I know." He said, "You always know." "Not always," she said, "but usually." He reached across the table and set his hand over hers. The same way he'd taken her hand in the kitchen, careful, complete, no performance. The summer brought change the way Montana summers bring everything fast and full and more than you'd planned for. Margaret found her footing slowly, then quickly, the way people find footing when the ground is solid under them. She started helping in the kitchen, not because anyone asked, but because she was her mother's daughter and couldn't be in a kitchen without wanting to be useful. She was good. Not as good as Evelyn, she'd say so herself directly in the family way that meant it as a fact rather than a complaint, but good enough that Evelyn could, for the first time in years, occasionally step away from the kitchen without it falling apart. She stepped away. She learned the ranch, not the way she'd learned it from the kitchen window, and the supply ledger, and the weather signs, and the men's faces over their supper bowls. The other way, the way that involves being out in it. She learned the south pasture and what Cole had meant about the grazing. She learned the horse paddock and the half-wild mare that was less than half-wild now and would eat from Evelyn's hand if approached correctly. She learned the fence lines and the creek and the east slope where the sage grew and the particular quality of light on Montana mornings that hit the mountains first and then came down to the valley like it had taken its time and knew it. She learned it like it belonged to her, because it did. Old Russ said on a morning in June when she'd brought coffee out to where he was working fence, "Your mother would have liked this place." She looked at him. "You never met my mother." "No," he said, "but I know you, and you're the best of her, I'd wager." He accepted the coffee. "My wife would have liked you too." She sat on the fence post beside him. "Tell me something else about her," she said. And he did. Cole found them there an hour later. The old man and the not-so-young woman sitting on a fence post in the morning sun, talking about people who weren't there anymore, keeping them present, the only way anyone ever keeps anyone present. He stood for a moment watching them, and whatever he was thinking, he kept it. But he stayed. He leaned on the fence post and listened, and after a while he told a story of his own about his father and about a summer when he was 17, and the ranch had been his father's, and nothing had seemed possible, and everything had been hard, and how his father had said hard is not the same as hopeless. You remember that? Evelyn listened to him tell it. She thought, this is what I wanted. Not the rescue, not the proof, not the one more chance to show that she was worth something to people who'd already decided she wasn't. This. A fence post and morning coffee, and an old man's stories, and a difficult man's quiet honesty, and the particular warmth of being somewhere that had decided, not because it had to, but because it was true that she belonged. Hank Dawson put up the new south fence section himself, and when it was done, he stood back and looked at it and said to no one in particular, "That'll hold." Billy wrote his mother a letter every week now, and she wrote back, and one Thursday he came into the kitchen with the letter and a grin that was still young enough to be uncomplicated, and he said, "She's coming to visit in the fall." "She's welcome," Evelyn said. "You haven't met her," Billy said. "She raised you," Evelyn said. "She's welcome." He laughed and went. She made dinner that evening, the way she made dinner every evening, completely without half measures, with the accumulated knowledge of everything her mother had taught her, and everything she'd learned since, and everything she still had left to learn. She made it for 12 men who had stopped being strangers and started being something that didn't have a better word than family. She made it for her sister who was finding her feet. She made it for Cole Walker, who had said, "Hard is not the same as hopeless," and who had taken her hand in the kitchen and who tipped his hat every single morning without fail. She made it because this was what she was. This was the fullest expression of everything she knew how to do and everything she knew how to give, and she had spent too many years being ashamed of it to waste another day. Cole came in for dinner last, as he always did, and he stopped in the kitchen doorway for a moment. A habit she'd noticed this pause, like he was checking that the kitchen was still there, that it was still warm, that she was still in it. She was still in it. She looked up. He looked at her with the expression she'd finally found a name for some time in the weeks between the spring drive and the June morning on the fence post. She'd been wrong to think it had no name. It had a very precise name. It was the expression of a man looking at the thing he was most grateful for and being completely clear-eyed about it. She held it. She didn't look away. "Dinner's ready," she said. "I know," he said. "I could smell it from the barn." "Is that a compliment?" "It's the best one I have," he said. She turned back to the stove and smiled, a real one, the kind that she'd stopped managing and had started just allowing, because managed smiles were exhausting and she had better things to do with her energy. Behind her, she heard him move to the table. She heard the chair. She heard the specific sound of Cole Walker setting himself down in her kitchen, which was one of the most ordinary sounds in the world, and also in the way of things that have been earned rather than given one of the best. The woman who had walked through his gate with a split boot and a leather bag, and one offer, and nothing else had not been saved by Silver Peak Ranch. Silver Peak Ranch had been saved because she walked through that gate, and she had stayed, and she was staying. And that was not the end of anything. That was exactly where everything worth having had just begun.